I came home from work to find a chainsaw resting against the splintered remains of my cedar fence, and my neighbor Karen standing smugly on my side of the property line, sipping a kale smoothie like she hadn't just committed property destruction in broad daylight. She didn't even flinch when I stopped my car. Instead, she pointed at the gap in the fence like it was some kind of grand improvement. "You're welcome," she said. "Now I can walk straight through instead of around." I blinked, assuming for a moment that this was some performance art project. It wasn't. Karen had, quite literally, cut a 10-foot hole into my fence because she found walking the extra 60 feet to her driveway inefficient. My jaw didn't even get a chance to drop before she added, "And don't bother fixing it. I've checked, your fence is actually on my easement. I'm just reclaiming what's mine." Now, I'm not usually one for drama. I pay my taxes, mow my lawn, and prefer peace over confrontation. But something about the way she smirked when she said, "reclaiming," flipped a switch. Not panic, not rage, just quiet, calculated disbelief. My fence wasn't even close to her property line. And the kicker? Karen had only lived next door for 6 months. She bought the dilapidated house on the corner, slapped a fresh coat of eggshell white on it, and suddenly started acting like she was chair of the neighborhood tribunal. She'd already reported me twice to the non-existent HOA, once for excessive grass growth, and once for a threatening garden gnome. I thought those were isolated flares of Karen's syndrome. But this was different. This was deliberate. I asked her plainly, "Did you seriously chainsaw my fence for shortcut access to your backyard?" She answered like I'd asked her if water was wet. "It's not a backyard. It's shared open space. You just stuck a fence on it and pretended it was yours." I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because my brain was trying to compute the absurdity without short-circuiting. Then she turned and walked back toward her porch, heel-turning like she'd just dropped the mic. The smoothie sloshed in rhythm with her smugness. That's when I noticed she'd also flattened 2 of my hostas with her boot. The plants I'd spent 3 summers nurturing. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I called the county. Zoning. Code enforcement. Anyone with a badge and a clipboard. It turns out, not only was my fence not on an easement, but I had the original 1987 property survey proving it. And better yet, Karen's house sat on a fragmented double lot that had a tiny parcel tacked on during a shady refinance 2 owners ago. A parcel that included the narrow strip of grass she'd always claimed was her private greenbelt access. It wasn't. It was a recorded but separate lot, its own tax ID and everything. At the time, I didn't know just how important that detail would become. I sent Karen a certified letter with the findings, politely requesting she reimburse me for the fence damage and avoid trespassing. She tore it in half and left the pieces on my porch. The next morning, there was a sign staked in the middle of my flower bed, "Private pathway, do not obstruct." A laminated sign. Laminated. Karen had graduated from passive aggression to architectural delusion. I took photos. I documented. And I started digging. It didn't take long to find the nugget of gold. See, Karen hadn't paid property taxes on that sliver parcel for 3 years. It had fallen through the cracks during her purchase, probably a clerical miss by her title company. Technically, she didn't own that little strip at all. The county did. It was headed for auction at the end of the quarter. An auction that allowed pre-bids from private citizens. Citizens like me. I won't lie and pretend I didn't cackle when I clicked that submit button. For $117, I placed the only bid on the contested property line. And I got it. Legally. Quietly. Cleanly. While Karen continued waltzing across what she thought was her empire, I was finalizing ownership with the county. And I didn't say a word. Meanwhile, Karen escalated. She threw a backyard block party, without notifying anyone. Just a rager for her yoga friends that spilled wine coolers and hummus across my mulch. Her guests parked half on my lawn. When I politely asked her to have them move, she laughed and offered me a tofu skewer. A week later, she installed string lights across the missing section of my fence, claiming it felt more open this way. I kept documenting. I said nothing, just a tight smile and nod every time we crossed paths. Then the day arrived. The deed transfer came in the mail. I officially owned the 10-foot strip of land she was illegally using as her shortcut. And here's where things got truly satisfying. I hired a surveyor and a local contractor, not to build a new fence, but a wall. A tall, clean, legally permitted privacy wall on my property. Right where her shortcut used to be. One Saturday morning, while she was out at a hot yoga class, the crew arrived and got to work. Karen came back mid-afternoon to find her smoothie path walled off with a 6-foot barricade and a bright blue sign. Private property and no trespassing. The screaming began in earnest around 3:45 p.m. I heard it from my living room. At first I ignored it, but curiosity won out. I stepped outside to see her flailing at the wall like it had personally insulted her. "You can't build this here," she shrieked. "This is my access point. You're blocking me in." I calmly handed her a copy of the deed, folded neatly in a manila envelope. She scanned it like she expected it to catch fire. Her lips moved, trying to refute it, but her eyes told the truth. She knew. She'd lost the bluff. But Karen wasn't done. Not even close. The next week, I got a visit from a county inspector claiming I'd built the wall too close to a drainage path. When I showed him the permits and photos of Karen's own landscaping rerouting water into my yard, he shook his head and said, "Yikes." That same day, someone dumped a pile of compost in my driveway. No note, but it smelled suspiciously of defeat and desperation. I cleaned it up with a smile. Then came the letters. Karen had found a lawyer, one of those low-rent firms that advertises on bus benches, and she was demanding I restore traditional neighborhood access, or face a nuisance suit. I sent a polite, one-page response. "You destroyed my fence. You trespassed. You refused to pay taxes. I now own the land. Please direct future correspondence to my legal counsel." I didn't actually have one yet, but the bluff worked. Her lawyer ghosted her. But the final straw wasn't legal. It was emotional. One evening, I watched from my kitchen window as Karen tried to show off her garden to some guest. She strutted toward the gap like she always had, only to stop short in front of the new wall. She stuttered, flushed, pretended like she'd meant to turn around all along. Her guests looked confused. One even laughed. And that, I realized, was the thing she hated most. Not the wall, not the land, not even losing. It was the humiliation of being exposed as a fraud in front of people who mattered to her. That was when I knew she wouldn't give up. And I needed a bigger plan. Something final. Something that would lock her out for good. The next move came faster than I expected. Karen, apparently determined to regain her imaginary shortcut, filed a complaint with the county zoning board. I was notified via an official-looking letter that accused me of obstructing historical right-of-way access. I had to reread it 3 times to be sure it wasn't a prank. Historical right-of-way? This woman had lived next door for less than a year. I'd been on my property for 6, and there was no record, past or present, of any access agreement involving my land. I suspected she found the term on some real estate blog and decided to use it like a magic spell, hoping the bureaucracy would buckle before I could counter. I wasn't about to let that happen. I brought everything to the zoning board hearing. Old surveys, the purchase documents for the parcel, photographs of Karen's signage and string lights, even screenshots of her social media posts where she referred to the area as my shortcut to peace. The cherry on top? A notarized statement from the previous owner of her home, who confirmed under oath that no such access had ever existed. The board took about 12 minutes to deliberate. Her complaint was denied unanimously. One of the board members even chuckled and said, "Ma'am, buying a smoothie doesn't entitle you to eminent domain." Karen stormed out of the meeting like it was a rigged trial, muttering something about class action lawsuits and municipal corruption. I figured that would be the end of it. But as always with Karen, she didn't just lick her wounds, she tried to weaponize them. The very next morning, I woke up to find orange flags staked across my lawn, following the path of a line I didn't recognize. Confused, I followed them, only to discover a crew from a local utility company standing near my shed, prepping what looked like ground-penetrating equipment. One guy waved and said, "We're here to mark the gas line reroute. New main going through this strip." I froze. "What strip?" I asked. He pointed casually toward the same 10-foot path Karen had used before I built the wall. "This right here. Work order came in yesterday. Says it's shared access, under community easement." Now, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I'm also not stupid. There was no way that was a coincidence. Karen had submitted a fraudulent work order claiming that the land I just purchased was still available for shared infrastructure upgrade. I immediately called the county utility office. They checked their records. Sure enough, someone had filed the request under my parcel number, but the name on the request wasn't mine. It was listed under a K. Madsen, Karen's last name, and she'd used a fake P.O. box in the return address. It was impersonation, plain and simple. That was the tipping point. I filed a formal police report for property fraud and impersonation. A detective followed up within the week. Turns out Karen had a little history. Nothing serious, just a couple of nuisance citations in her previous neighborhood, but enough to flag her as a repeat problem. The detective asked me if I wanted to press charges. I said I did, but only if it came to that. Honestly, at that point I was more interested in ending the game permanently. I started researching her lot again, this time with an eye toward structural vulnerabilities. I was hoping to find some kind of leverage, anything that would shift the balance fully in my favor. That's when I found it. Tucked deep into the county property records was a tiny detail about Karen's house that she clearly hadn't noticed. The garage encroached onto yet another sliver parcel that was technically not included in her property deed. It had been left out during a title transfer in the 90s, and was still legally owned by the estate of someone who'd passed away years ago with no known heirs. It was dormant property, forgotten land that nobody had touched in decades, but the county had finally declared it dormant surplus, and was preparing to release it for auction as part of a tax recovery initiative. It was up for grabs, and once again I was the only bidder. For the price of a decent microwave, I acquired ownership of the land directly under the outer third of Karen's detached garage. I didn't celebrate. I didn't announce it. I waited, patiently, because I knew exactly how to use it. 2 weeks later, I served her with a letter of encroachment, polite, professional, and devastatingly real. It explained that part of her structure now stood on land she didn't own and never had legal right to use, and that unless she was willing to purchase the sliver from me at a premium, I'd be filing for forced removal via structural code violation. In layman's terms, she had 30 days to tear down part of her garage or write me a check with a lot of zeros. The response came the next morning. Karen marched over to my porch in a robe and slippers, mascara smudged under her eyes like she hadn't slept. She held the letter in one hand and a steaming mug in the other. I opened the door, calm as ever. "You've gone too far," she hissed. "You're harassing me now. This is malicious property warfare." I smiled thinly. "No, Karen. This is real estate." She started to say something else, but instead dumped her coffee onto my doormat and stormed off. That was her final act of rebellion before reality set in. She tried to fight it, of course. Filed another zoning appeal. Hired a different lawyer, one who actually wore a tie. They tried to argue adverse possession, claiming the garage had been there so long it must have acquired permanent use rights. But the paperwork showed otherwise. The parcel had never been legally merged. The garage was built decades after the land transfer mistake. It wasn't grandfathered in. The judge's ruling came swift and brutal. She could pay me a negotiated fee for the encroached land, or begin removal proceedings within 45 days. That was when the cracks in her perfect facade began to show. I started seeing the "For Sale by Owner" sign in her front yard, handwritten, slightly crooked. A few weeks after that, I spotted her outside with a tape measure, pacing angrily along her garden's edge, muttering to herself like a math professor solving an equation that refused to balance. But she still didn't sell. I think some part of her couldn't accept the humiliation of losing, not just the land, but the game. She doubled down on being petty. She started blaring music toward my house during weekday mornings. She left her trash bins half blocking my driveway. Once, she let her sprinkler run all night, soaking my side yard. But none of it rattled me. Because I had the upper hand. And she knew it. Then came the real surprise. A local developer knocked on my door one evening. They were planning to build a set of townhomes on the vacant corner lot a few doors down, and they wanted to know if I'd be willing to sell the sliver I now owned under Karen's garage. Just enough for them to access the side street for utilities and fire code requirements. They offered me 20 times what I'd paid for it. I said yes. But I added one condition. Karen's structure had to be cleared before any construction began. I got the first inkling something was off when a stranger pulled into Karen's driveway and began taking photos of her garage, or what was left of it. He had one of those clipboards with laminated sheets and a laser measurer clipped to his belt, like every home inspector I'd ever met. I was trimming my hedges and pretended not to notice him, but I kept one ear open. He walked the property for a good 20 minutes, even crossed the sidewalk to pace along the privacy wall I'd built on my now legally mine shortcut strip. He didn't knock on my door or make eye contact. He was methodical, silent, focused. Not a real estate agent, then, something deeper. I took a mental note, just in time to catch Karen watching me from her kitchen window like a hawk tracking prey. That night, curiosity got the best of me. I ran a search on Zillow, Redfin, every site I could think of. And there it was. Karen had put her house on the market, quietly, with a vague, upbeat listing that read like it had been written by a delusional optimist. Charming corner property with recent structural modifications and room for expansion, it said. Not a word about the partial garage removal, or the wall blocking the backyard access. She had also conveniently edited the photos to cut off every detail that might raise red flags. Her price? Laughable. Nearly 20% higher than the highest recent comp in the neighborhood. A pipe dream. But it wasn't the price that interested me. It was the clause tucked into the fine print at the bottom of the listing, subject to buyer's ability to resolve minor encumbrance with adjacent parcel owner. She was trying to sell the house with my land dispute still attached, like it was just a minor nuisance someone else could sort out. Translation: she was betting that some gullible buyer would take the bait and try to negotiate with me after the ink was dry. That was a new level of bold, even for her. But it also meant one thing: she was desperate. She needed out. And I needed to figure out why. It didn't take long. My buddy Nick works in local title insurance, and after I bought him a steak and a couple bourbons, he agreed to run a background check on Karen's property. What he found made my eyebrows jump. She had taken out a massive home equity loan just 3 months after moving in, more than double what she'd paid for the place. That loan had ballooned thanks to rising interest rates and Karen's apparent failure to make consistent payments. Worse, the house itself was technically underwater after the garage situation devalued it. In other words, she owed more than the place was worth. And she was trying to offload the mess onto someone else before the bank stepped in. That explained the sudden friendliness I started getting. It began with small things. A wave from her porch, a compliment on my new lawn edging, a box of generic cookies left on my doorstep with a note that said, "No hard feelings?" I didn't touch them. I knew Karen too well by now. She wasn't capable of peace, only strategy. She was softening me up, trying to get me to let my guard down. And sure enough, 2 days later, she knocked on my door. She looked different, less smug, more tired. Her hair was frizzed from humidity, and her makeup was halfway melted off her face. "I wanted to talk," she said. I nodded wordlessly. Look, she began, I know we've had our issues. But this has gotten out of hand. We're neighbors. We don't have to be enemies. I almost laughed at the Hallmark delivery, but I let her talk. She launched into a speech about community, second chances, and resetting expectations. Then came the pitch. If I can sell the house, I can pay off the loan. But I need your cooperation. Just a simple letter saying you're open to negotiating access to the property strip. Nothing binding, just a gesture. It'll help me close. We can make it work for both of us. There it was. The whole act reduced to a simple favor that would give her everything she wanted and leave me in the lurch. I smiled politely and said I'd think about it. She seemed hopeful, maybe even genuinely relieved. But once she left, I got to work. Because what Karen didn't know was that I'd already been approached, twice, by cash buyers asking about the garage parcel. She thought I was just sitting on it out of spite. She had no clue I was actively entertaining offers from real investors, ones with no intention of helping her. But then, another twist. A letter arrived in my mailbox that wasn't from Karen, it was from a legal firm representing a Shell LLC. The message was simple. Our client is interested in acquiring parcel #8771B, the strip under Karen's garage. They are prepared to offer a generous cash settlement and request a meeting to discuss terms. I googled the LLC name. It led back to a generic address in Florida with no real paper trail. But the registered agent? Karen's cousin, 3 states away. She was trying to buy the land from me anonymously, probably assuming I'd accept a higher offer if I didn't know it was her. Now, I don't know what kind of reality she lives in, but the moment I saw through the scam, I knew how to respond. I contacted the LLC's lawyer directly and said I was only willing to sell the parcel as part of a complete acquisition deal, including her main property, the garage, and the strip. I gave them a ridiculous number, high enough to be laughable. Then I waited. 3 days later, Karen knocked again. This time, no makeup, no charm, just fury. You think you're clever? She snapped. Do you honestly think you can bleed me like this? I've already had buyers walk away. You're ruining everything. I looked her straight in the eye. No, Karen. I'm protecting what's mine. You started this when you cut down my fence. Remember? She sputtered something unintelligible and stomped off. But I knew the dam had cracked. The stress was mounting, and I was about to push her over the edge. I decided to act preemptively. I printed out flyers that simply read, for sale, investment opportunity, partial ownership of 114 Sycamore via access parcel rights. Inquire within. I taped one to the privacy wall, another to the lamppost on the corner, and I posted a photo of the flyer in a local Facebook group known for real estate gossip. The comments exploded. Within hours, people were speculating wildly about the petty neighbor war and land grab drama. I never mentioned names. I didn't have to. Everyone knew who it was about. Karen lost it. She called the cops, claimed I was harassing her. An officer came by, looked at the flyer, then at my deed. He shrugged and said, "It's weird, but it's not illegal." I offered him a cold soda and sent him on his way. That weekend, I noticed a moving truck in her driveway. Not large enough to be a real move, but just big enough to suggest she was clearing out valuables. Maybe prepping for foreclosure. Or maybe, just maybe, she was running out of moves. Either way, I wasn't done. I contacted the developer who'd offered me cash for the garage parcel. I told him I'd accept, but I wanted 2 things in writing: a non-negotiable timeline for demolition and permission to install surveillance on-site during the transition. He agreed immediately. The garden easement was small, just a 600-square-foot sliver running behind Karen's house, originally intended as a shared access corridor for utility workers decades ago. But no one had used it since the early 2000s. Karen had converted it into a half-hearted herb garden with a warped bench and an ugly gnome statue that always looked like it wanted to escape. She'd posted a sign back there that read Tranquility Zone, Resident Access Only, as if her property were some kind of private wellness retreat instead of a mid-renovation money pit. The parcel wasn't even officially part of her deed. I'd only found it because I started combing through county records like it was my new hobby. And it paid off. The easement had been reclassified as an abandoned utility strip and was about to be auctioned off for non-payment of administrative back taxes. Just $61.42 in unpaid fees stood between Karen and the legal ownership of her so-called Tranquility Zone. But she hadn't noticed. Probably too busy trying to sell her house at an inflated price to worry about a little red flag buried in the zoning notifications. I paid those $61.42 without blinking. 2 weeks later, I received the title in the mail. I now legally owned the rear passage behind her house. It connected to the land I already held under her garage and brushed up against the edge of the shortcut path I'd turned into a walled strip. Individually, these pieces of property looked like random scrap. Together, they formed a noose. Quiet. Legal. I wasn't just boxing Karen in physically, I was unwriting her concept of home from the ground up. Parcel by parcel, brick by brick. That weekend, I walked the perimeter of her backyard with a tape measure and a small crew I'd hired to evaluate the land for landscaping. Karen burst out the back door in her yoga pants and a panic-stricken expression. "What are you doing now?" she barked. "Measuring my property," I said with an almost comical calmness. This is my backyard," she said, gesturing at the garden as if it were Versailles. I handed her a copy of the deed. Same manila folder. Same quiet mic drop. "I'd advise you to move your statue," I said, nodding at the garden gnome, "unless you want it hauled off with the rest of the debris." She sputtered for a second, then grabbed the gnome as if it were a child in danger. She backed toward her deck in stunned silence, clutching it like a life preserver. I left her there and called the landscapers over to start chalk lining my new fence extension. I wasn't planning to wall it off, not yet. But I wanted her to know I could. At any moment. By now, the word had spread around the neighborhood. People I barely knew stopped me while walking their dogs to ask, "So is it true you bought her whole backyard?" Not quite, but close enough. The joke evolved quickly. Someone taped a sign to the community mailbox that said, "Coming soon. Karen's house, some assembly required." And yet, she still hadn't left. Her house was still listed, though now the price had dropped twice. The photos had changed, too. Instead of showcasing the backyard, the listing now featured artistic close-ups of the tile backsplash in the kitchen and an awkwardly cropped shot of the living room that carefully excluded the missing garage wall. It was a digital illusion, like selling a car by showing only the steering wheel. But here's where things got truly strange. I was watering my front shrubs one afternoon when a black Mercedes with dealership plates pulled into Karen's driveway. Out stepped a man in a perfectly tailored suit and sunglasses worth more than my entire wardrobe. He didn't knock on her door. Instead, he pulled out a folded blueprint from his briefcase and began taking measurements along the edge of the driveway. I approached slowly, pretending to be curious, and casually asked if he was there for a showing. He smirked. "I'm here on behalf of a potential buyer." "Oh? Anyone I'd know?" He offered a professional but thin smile. "Doubtful. My client's anonymous." That answer confirmed my suspicion. Karen wasn't just trying to sell. She was trying to hide who she was selling to. She had realized that nobody was going to buy a house boxed in by a neighbor who owned half the surrounding land, unless they had a reason not to care. Which meant she was courting someone big. A builder, maybe. A private investor who'd demolish the place and fold it into a bigger project. That could get her out clean. And it would undo everything I'd worked for. So I made a call. Actually, two. The first was to the planning department. I requested an update on zoning status for Karen's property and surrounding parcels, under the pretense of developing a contiguous lot line. The second was to my friend Nick again, who still owed me for that steak dinner. Within a day, I got word. There had been a quiet request filed to rezone Karen's lot as mixed-use residential. That only made sense if someone wanted to build multiple units on her plot. Townhouses, maybe. A duplex. Something big enough to justify ignoring my wall, my garden strip, my entire strategic fence network. I needed to shut it down, fast. Zoning applications are public, but approval isn't guaranteed. And the thing about zoning boards is that they're remarkably sensitive to community opposition. So I printed flyers. I talked to neighbors. I filed a formal objection stating that I owned all adjacent properties and that the proposed development would strain existing infrastructure, disrupt neighborhood aesthetics, and infringe upon current access and privacy agreements. That last one was a stretch, but it sounded official. I wasn't alone. Turns out, Karen had made more enemies than just me. The guy across the street, who she once reported for unsanitary flag placement? He signed my petition. The family with the autistic child, whose sensory needs Karen dismissed during one of her loud parties? They not only signed, they campaigned with me. When the zoning board met, we showed up in force. Karen didn't attend. But her potential buyer did. The guy in the suit, this time with a lawyer in tow. They tried to push through the rezoning as a harmless improvement, but the board was skeptical. They grilled them on setbacks, drainage, utility easements. The lawyer stumbled. The developer stammered. I sat in the back, calm, arms folded, letting the chaos bloom around them. In the end, the board delayed the decision, pending further review. That's bureaucratic speak for, probably not happening. The suit left in a hurry. And just like that, Karen's Hail Mary vanished. Days later, her listing was quietly removed. No sold sign. No pending. Just gone. Then came the U-Haul. It was small. Not a full move. But enough to suggest surrender. I saw her one last time, standing on her porch with that same expression she'd worn when the garage came down. Resignation. Not rage. She didn't wave. She didn't glare. She just watched me as I walked to my mailbox, expression unreadable, the defeated general watching the battlefield being cleared. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But the story wasn't over. Because just 3 days after she vanished, I got a letter from the county clerk's office. Karen had filed a quiet title action right before she left, trying to retroactively claim ownership of the shortcut parcel I had bought at auction. She was hoping no one would notice the paperwork in time to object. But she underestimated me. Again. The morning I posted the final sign, the sun hadn't fully crested over the trees. Dew still clung to the grass, and the air held that rare silence you only get right before something changes forever. The workers I hired had just finished installing the last section of iron fencing around what used to be Karen's shortcut, the forgotten garden easement, and the ghost of her garage foundation. And now, with city approval in hand, official permits stamped, and every legal document in place, it was done. My land. My park. My punctuation mark. The sign was matte black with white letters. Simple. Understated. But pointed. Karen's Shortcut Memorial Park, access. None. Underneath that, in smaller letters. Private. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. I didn't expect applause. I wasn't trying to be a hero or villain. I just wanted finality. Closure. A message in iron and soil that said, "You pushed." I pushed back. And now we're done. But as with everything in this saga, Karen had one last card to play. Not in person, she was long gone by then, but through the quiet title action she'd filed before disappearing. She was attempting to reverse claim ownership of the original shortcut parcel I'd purchased at auction, claiming she'd used it, openly and continuously, for access and maintenance. It was an old legal tactic, adverse possession through prescription. If she could prove she'd used the land without being challenged for a certain number of years, she might have a shot. Only problem? She hadn't been here long enough. Not even close. and I had a stack of evidence that proved she'd not only not used the land peacefully, but had been told, repeatedly and in writing, to stay off it. Still, I wasn't about to leave it to chance. I filed a counterclaim. My argument was airtight. I included everything: timestamps of her trespassing, photos of the broken fence, her laminated shortcut sign, the cease and desist letters, the utility scam, even a transcript from the zoning meeting where her encroachments were denied. I built a wall of paper so high that any judge would need a ladder and aspirin just to get through it. The hearing was set for the following week. I half expected Karen to appear in person, maybe in some rebranded reinvention of herself, wearing beige linen and carrying a notebook of spiritual quote. But she didn't show. Her lawyer did, clearly embarrassed to be there. He presented her claim without enthusiasm, clearly aware he was swimming upstream with a cinder block tied to his waist. The judge listened patiently. Then he turned to me. "Is there any reason," he asked, "why you named the public-facing portion of your property Karen's Shortcut Memorial Park?" I smiled politely and said, "Yes, Your Honor. It's a reminder that ignoring boundaries has consequences." The judge smirked. A few spectators chuckled. The lawyer sighed. Karen's claim was denied on the spot. The land was officially and permanently mine, in full legal standing. It should have felt like victory. And it did. But not in the way I expected. It wasn't a triumphant drumroll or a soaring anthem. It was quiet. Like exhaling after holding your breath for too long. Like the closing of a door that should have been shut years ago. And in that stillness, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't hate Karen. Not really. I pitied her. Every single escalation she launched was rooted in fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being irrelevant, fear that someone else might be right. She didn't crave land. She craved dominance. And when she couldn't achieve it, she unraveled. After the hearing, I walked back to the park. I sat on the new bench I'd installed, right where her garden gnome used to squat. From there, I could see her old house, now empty, bank-owned, the lawn overgrown and the siding starting to peel. No buyers had come. The investors lost interest after the zoning board shut them down. The property had become what it always threatened to be, a monument to stubbornness and spite. That night, I hosted a few neighbors at the park. Just a casual gathering. Some cold drinks, a few folding chairs, quiet laughter as we shared stories of the reign of Karen. People brought lawn games and cookies. Someone even made t-shirts that said, "Shortcut Survivor." I didn't plan any of it. It just happened. Naturally. Like the neighborhood was healing. Reclaiming itself. Midway through the evening, an older woman I hadn't met before came up to me and said, "You're the guy who bought all the puzzle pieces." I laughed. "I guess that's one way to put it." She smiled gently. "My husband and I moved here in '89. I remember when this place was just open woods. Over the years, people tried to slice it up and claim bits of it, but no one ever figured out how to stitch it together again." I nodded slowly. "Until now." She looked around the park. "It's strange. Feels whole again. Not because of what you built, but because of what you stopped." That stuck with me. I spent the next few weeks turning Karen's Shortcut into something worth keeping. I planted shrubs, added a gravel path that led absolutely nowhere, just for the symbolism. I installed a bird feeder and named the squirrel that kept raiding it Greg. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about peace. I had reclaimed my fence, my time, my dignity. And in the process, I'd given the neighborhood something back. But the final twist came months later. I got a letter from a law firm in a neighboring county. Karen had apparently defaulted on every loan she had, and the bank was suing for recovery. Buried in the attached documents was a list of her declared assets. It was a sad little catalog of half-truths, a house she didn't own anymore, a garage that no longer existed, and, this was the kicker, exclusive garden access rights via easement. The very easement she'd lost to me. It was as if her entire reality had been built on make-believe. She never accepted that lines on a map meant something. That a fence wasn't just wood, it was law. That owning land wasn't the same as controlling people. She thought the world would bend if she pushed hard enough. But all she ever did was dig herself deeper. I never replied to the letter. There was nothing left to say. Spring came. The trees bloomed. I added a wooden archway to the entrance of the park, carved by a local artist. It read, "Boundaries make good neighbors." It wasn't meant as a dig. It was a truth I'd earned the hard way. A few times I'd catch someone walking by, pausing to read the sign. Some smiled. Some laughed. A few looked confused. And occasionally, one or two would stop and ask, "Who was Karen?" I'd just shake my head and say, "Long story?" Because in the end, it wasn't about her. It was about what she taught me. About patience. About limits. About how a well-placed fence can do more than protect your lawn. It can protect your peace. And maybe, just maybe, it can remind people that if you're going to try and take something that isn't yours, you'd better be ready for what comes next. Because sometimes the quiet neighbor isn't the pushover. Sometimes he owns the land under your house. And sometimes he names a park after your biggest mistake.